All right. Hi, everyone. So today I will be, well, first of all, let me turn on the ring light. Okay, much better. I'll be reading from the book The Shack by William Paul Young. Found this from one of those birdhouses. So in Houston here, probably some other cities too. There are these places where I just walk around and there's these little things in front of these houses that look like a birdhouse, and you open it up, and lo and behold, it's books, and you can take one, leave one, whatever. Um, so what I plan to do, and I got this from there. This was about like I don't know, half a year ago. Been was just curious about it. So what I plan to do is read some of it and then put it back in one of those birdhouses, so you can pass it on to others. There's certain books that I absolutely love and that I like to, I want to keep them. Most of the time, those are books I purchase. So for free books, I normally get them and then I just read them and then pass it on. So with this book, I'm going to skip the first number of pages and just go to the part where I feel like most of the pivotal message is here. So give you some context. The main character here, Mackenzie Allen Phillip, his daughter was abducted and brutally murdered um, during a family vacation, and he struggled a lot with the concept of God and everything. Basically his whole religious beliefs. I wouldn't say it came crashing down, but there's a lot of doubt about like why these bad things happen. And so then he gets a message in his mailbox telling him to come to the shack, which is where his one of his daughter's bodies was found. And he thought it was a joke, but decided to take it up like maybe God is giving him a message. And so he takes this lonesome journey by himself back to the shack, to the place where this horrible thing happened. Um, and yeah, that's basically the extent of it right now. And he's journaling up I guess the deserted trail. So, yes, I'm starting on page 80. Yeah, so page 80 here. So I'm going to start reading here. He had barely walked 50 feet up the trail when he felt a sudden rush of warm air overtake him from behind. The chirping of a songbird broke the icy silence. The path in front of him rapidly lost its veneer of snow and ice, as if someone were blow drying it. Max stopped and watched as all around him the white covering dissolved and was replaced by emerging and radiant growth. 3 weeks of spring unfurled before him in 30 seconds. He rubbed his eyes and steadied himself in the swirl of activity. Even the light snow that had begun to fall had changed to tiny blossoms lazily drifting to the ground. What he was seeing, of course, was not possible. The snowbanks had vanished, and summer wildflowers began to color the borders of the trail and into the forest as far as he could see. Robins and finches darted after one another among the trees. Squirrels and chipmunks occasionally crossed the path ahead, some stopping to sit up and watch him for a moment before plunging back into the undergrowth. He even thought that he glimpsed a young buck emerging out of a dark glade in the forest. But on second look, it was gone. As if that wasn't enough, the scent of blooms began to fill the air, not just the drifting aroma of wild mountain flowers, but the richness of roses and orchids and other exotic fragrances found in more tropical climes. Mac was no stranger. Mac was no longer thinking about home. A terror gripped him, as if he had opened up Pandora's box and was being swept away into the center of madness, to be lost forever. Unsteady, he carefully turned around, trying to hold on to some sense of sanity. He was stunned. Little, if anything, was the same. The dilapidated shack had been replaced by a sturdy and beautifully constructed log cabin, now standing directly between him and the lake, which he could see just above the rooftop. It was built out of hand-peeled full-length logs, everyone scribed for a perfect fit. Instead of the dark and forbidding overgrowth of brush, briars, and devil's club, everything that Mac could see was new, now postcard perfect. Smoke was lazily winding its way from the chimney into the late afternoon sky, a sign of activity inside. A walkway had been built to and around the front porch, bordered by a small white picket fence. The sound of laughter was coming from nearby, maybe inside, but he wasn't sure. Perhaps this is what it was like to experience a complete psychotic break. I'm losing it, Mac whispered to himself. This can't be happening. This isn't real. It was a place that Mac could only have imagined in his best dreams, and this made it all the more suspect. The sights were wondrous, the scents intoxicating, and his feet, as if they had a mind of their own, took him back down the walkway and up into onto the front porch. Flowers bloomed everywhere, and the mix of floral fragrances and pungent herbs aroused hints of memories long forgotten. He had always heard that the nose was the best link to the past, that the olfactory sense was the strongest for tapping into forgotten history, and now some long stored remembrances of his own childhood flitted through his mind. Once on the porch, he stopped again. Voices were clearly coming from inside. Mac rejected the sudden impulse to run away, as if he were some kid who had thrown his ball into a neighbor's flower garden. But if God is inside, it wouldn't do much good anyway, would it? He closed his eyes and shook his head to see if he could erase the hallucination and restore reality. But when he opened them, it was all still there. He tentatively reached out and touched the wood railing. It certainly seemed real. He now faced another dilemma. What should you do when you come to the door of a house, or cabin in this case, where God might be? Should you knock? Presumably, God already knew that Mac was there. Maybe he had to simply walk in and introduce himself. But that seemed equally absurd. And how should he address him? Should he call him Father, or Almighty One, or perhaps Mr. God? And would it be best if he fell down and worship? Not that he was really in the mood. As he tried to establish some inner mental balance, the anger that he thought had so recently died inside him began to emerge. No longer concerned with caring about what to call God and energized by his ire, he walked up to the door. Mac decided to bang loudly and see what happened. But just as he raised his fist to do so, the door flew open and he was looking directly into the face of a large, beaming African American woman. Instinctively, he jumped back, but he was too slow. With speed that belied her size, she crossed the distance between them and engulfed him in her arms, lifting him clear off his feet and spinning him around like a little child. And all the while, she was shouting his name, Mackenzie Allen Phillips, with the ardor of someone seeing a long-lost and deeply loved relative. She finally put him back on earth, and with her hands on his shoulders, pushed him back as if to get a good look at him. Mac, look at you, she fairly exploded. Here you are, and so grown up. I've really been looking forward to seeing you face to face. It is so wonderful to have you here with us. My, how I do love you. And with that, she wrapped herself around him again. Mac was speechless. In a few seconds, this woman had breached pretty much every social propriety behind which he had so safely entrenched himself. But something in the way that she looked at him and yelled his name made him equally delighted to see her too, even though he didn't have a clue who she was. Suddenly, he was overwhelmed by the scent emanating from her, and it shook him. It was the smell of flowers with overtones of gardenia and jasmine, unmistakably his mother's perfume that he kept hidden away in his little tin box. He had already been perched precariously on the precipice of emotion, and now the flooding scent and attendant memories staggered him. He could feel the warmth of tears beginning to gather behind his eyes, as if they were knocking on the door of his heart. It seemed that she saw them too. It's okay, honey. You can let it all out. I know you've been hurt, and I know you're angry and confused, so go ahead and let it out. It does the soul good to let the waters run once in a while, the healing waters. But while Matt could not stop the tears from filling his eyes, he was not ready to let go. Not yet. Not with this woman. With every effort he could muster, he kept himself from falling back into the black hole of his emotions. Meanwhile, this woman stood there with her arms outstretched as if they were the very arms of his mother. He felt the presence of love. It was warm, inviting, melting. Not ready? She responded. That's okay. We'll do things on your terms and time. Well, come on in. Can I take your coat and that gun? You don't really need that, do you? We wouldn't want anyone to get hurt, would we? Mac wasn't sure what to do or what to say. Who was she? How did she know? He was rooted to the spot where he stood, but slowly and mechanically, he took off his coat. The large black woman gathered his coat and he handed her the gun, which she took from him with 2 fingers as if it was contaminated. Just as she turned to enter the cabin, a small, distinctively Asian woman emerged from behind her. Here, let me take those, her voice saying. Obviously, she had not meant the coat or gun, but something else, and she was in front of him in a blink of an eye.
He stiffened as he felt something sweep gently across his cheek. Without moving, he looked down and could see that she was busy with a fragile crystal bottle and a small brush, like that he had seen Nan and Kate use for makeup, gently removing something from his face. Before he could ask, she smiled and whispered, Mackenzie, we all have things we value enough to collect, don't we? His little tin box flashed through his mind. I collect tears. As she stepped back, Mac found himself involuntarily squinting in her direction, as if doing so would allow his eyes to see her better. But strangely, he still had a difficult time focusing on her. She seemed almost to shimmer in the light, and her hair blew in all directions, even though there was hardly a breeze. It was almost easier to see her out of the corner of his eye than it was to look at her directly. He then glanced past her and noticed that third person had emerged from the cabin, this one a man. He appeared Middle Eastern and was dressed like a laborer, complete with tool belt and gloves. He stood easily, leaning against a door jamb with the arms crossed in front of him, wearing jeans covered in wood dust and a plaid shirt with sleeves rolled just above the elbows, revealing well-muscled forearms. His features were pleasant enough, but he was not particularly handsome, not a man who would stick out in a crowd. But his eyes and smile lit up his face, and Mac found it difficult to look away. Max stepped back again, feeling a bit overwhelmed. Are there more of you? He asked a little hoarsely. The three looked at one another and laughed. Mac couldn't help but smile. No, Mackenzie, chuckled the black woman. We is all that you get, and believe me, we're more than enough. Mac tried again to look at the Asian woman. From what he could tell, this wiry-looking person was maybe of northern Chinese or Nepalese or even Mongolian ethnicity. It was hard to tell because his eyes had to work to see her at all. From her clothing, Mac assumed she was a groundskeeper or gardener. She had gloves folded into her belt, not the heavy leathers of the man, but the lightweight cloth and rubber ones that Mac himself used for yard work at home. She was dressed in plain jeans with ornamental designs of the fringes, knees covered in dirt from where she had been kneeling, and a brightly colored blouse with splashes of yellow and red and blue. But he knew all this was more of an impression of her than from actually seeing her, as she seemed to phase in and out of his vision. The man then stepped in, touched Mac on the shoulder, gave him a kiss on both cheeks, and embraced him strongly. Mac knew instantly that he liked him. As they separated, the man stepped back and the Asian lady moved toward him again, this time taking his face in both her hands. Gradually and intentionally, she moved her face closer to his, and just when he imagined she was going to kiss him, she stopped and looked deep into his eyes. Mac thought he could almost see through her. Then she smiled, and her sense seemed to wrap themselves around him and lift a huge weight off his shoulders, as if he had been carting his gear in a backpack. Max suddenly felt lighter than air, almost as if he were no longer touching the ground. She was hugging him without hugging him, or really without even touching him. Only when she pulled back, which was probably just seconds later, did he realize that he was still standing on his feet, and that his feet were still touching the deck. Oh, don't mind her, the big black woman laughed. She has that effect on everyone. I like it, he muttered, and all three burst into more laughter. And now Mac found himself laughing along with them, not knowing exactly why, and not really caring either. When they finally stopped giggling, the large woman put her arm around Mac's shoulders, drew him to her, and said, Okay, we know who you are, but we should probably introduce ourselves to you. She waved her hands with a flourish, am the housekeeper and cook. You can call me Alucia. Alucia? Asked Mac, not comprehending at all. Okay, you don't have to call me Alucia. It is just a name I'm rather fond of and has particular meaning to me. So, she crossed her arms and put one hand under her chin as if thinking especially hard. You can call me what Nan does. What, you don't mean... Now, Mac was surprised and even more confused. Surely this was not the Papa who sent the note. I mean, are you saying Papa? Yes, she responded and smiled, waiting for him to speak as if he were about to say something, which he was not at all. And I, interrupted the man, who looked to be about in his 30s and stood a little shorter than Mac himself. I try to keep things fixed up around here. I enjoy working with my hands, although, as these two would tell you, I take pleasure in cooking and gardening as much as they do. You look as if you're from the Middle East, maybe Arab, Mac guessed. Actually, I'm a stepbrother of that great family. I'm Hebrew, to be exact, from the house of Judah. Then Mac was suddenly staggered by his own realization. Then you are Jesus, yes, and you may call me that if you like. After all, it has become my common name. My mother called me Yeshua, but I have also been known to respond to Joshua or even Jesse. Max stood dumbfounded and mute. What he was looking at and listening to simply would not compute. It was also impossible, but here he was. Or was he really here at all? Suddenly he felt faint. Emotion swept over him as his mind attempted desperately to catch up with all the information. Just as he was about to crumple to his knees, the Asian woman stepped closer and deflected his attention. And I am Sarayu, she said as she tilted her head in a slight bow and smiled, keeper of the gardens, among other things. Thoughts tumbled over each other as Max struggled to figure out what to do. Was one of these people God? What if they were hallucinations or angels, where God was coming later? That could be embarrassing. Since there were three of them, maybe this was a Trinity sort of thing. But two women, a man, and none of them white? Then again, why had he naturally assumed that God would be white? He knew his mind was rambling, so he focused on the one question he most wanted answered. Then Max struggled to ask, which one of you is God? I am, said all three in unison. Mac looked from one to the next, and even though he couldn't begin to grasp what he was seeing and hearing, he somehow believed them. Chapter 6, A Piece of Pie. The quote is, no matter what God's power may be, the first aspect of God is never that of the absolute master, the Almighty. It is that of the God who puts himself on a human level and limits himself. Quoted by Jacques Ellul, Ellul, from the book Anarchy and Christianity. Well, Mackenzie, don't just stand there gawking with your mouth open like your pants are full, said the big black woman as she turned and headed across the deck, talking the whole time. Come and talk to me while I get supper on, or if you don't want to do that, you can do whatever you want behind the cabin. She gestured over the roof without looking or slowing down. You'll find a fishing pole by the boat shed that you can use to catch some lake trout. She stopped at the door to give Jesus a kiss. Just remember, she turned to look back at Mac, you got to clean what you catch. Then with a quick smile, she disappeared in the cabin, armed with Mac's winter coat and still carrying the gun by 2 fingers, a full arm's length away from her. Mac was standing there with his mouth indeed open, an expression of bewilderment plastered to his face. He hardly noticed when Jesus walked over and put an arm around his shoulder. Saria seemed to have just evaporated. Isn't she great? Exclaimed Jesus, grinning at Mac. Mac turned and faced him, shaking his head. Am I going crazy? Am I supposed to believe that God is a big black woman with a questionable sense of humor? Jesus laughed. She's a riot. You can always... Okay, that was a little strange. I think my connection broke for a little bit. Yeah, it looks like it did. Okay, so let me continue on. You're not supposed to do anything. You're free to do whatever you like, Jesus paused and then continued, trying to help by giving Mac a few suggestions. I am working on a... or you could go fishing, canoeing, or go in and talk to Papa. Well, I sort of feel obligated to go in and talk to him. Her? Oh, now Jesus is serious. Don't go because you feel obligated. That won't get you any points around here. Go because it's what you want to do. Mac thought for a moment and decided that going into the cabin actually was what he wanted to do. He thanked Jesus, who smiled, turned, and headed off to his workshop. And Max stepped across the deck and up to the door. Again, he was alone, but after a quick look around, he carefully opened it. He stuck his head in, hesitated, and then decided to take the plunge. God, he called, rather timidly and feeling more than a little foolish. I'm in the kitchen, Mackenzie. Just follow my voice. He walked in and scanned the room. Could this even be the same place? He shuddered at the whisper of lurking dark thoughts and again locked them out. Across the room, a hallway disappeared at an angle. Glancing around the corner into the living room, his eyes searched out the spot near the fireplace, but there was no stain marring the wood surface. He noticed that the room was decorated tastefully with art that looked like it had been either drawn or handcrafted by children. He wondered if this woman treasured each of these pieces, like any parent who loved her children would. Maybe that was how she valued anything that was given to her from her heart, the way children seem to give so easily. Mac followed her soft humming down a short hallway and into an open kitchen dining area, complete with a small four-seat table and wicker-back chairs. The inside of the cabin was roomier than he had expected. Papa was working on something with her back to him, flower flying as she swayed to the music of whatever she was listening to. The song obviously came to an end, marked by a couple of last shoulder and hip shakes. Turning to face him, she took off the headphones. Suddenly, Mac wanted to ask 1,000 questions, or say 1,000 things, some of them unspeakable and terrible. He was sure that his face betrayed the emotions he was battling to control, and then in a flash of a second, he shoved everything back into his battered hearth's closet, locking the door on the way out. If she knew his inner conflict, she showed nothing by her expression, still open, full of life, and inviting. He inquired, "May I know what you're listening to? You really want to know?" "Sure." No, Mac was curious. "West Coast Juice, group called Diatribe, and an album that isn't even out yet, called Heart Trips, actually." She winked at Mac. "These kids haven't even been born yet." "Right," Mac responded, more than a little incredulous. "West Coast Juice? Huh, it doesn't sound very religious." "Oh, trust me, it's not. More like Eurasian funk and blues with a message and a great beat." She sidestepped toward Mac as if she were doing a dance move and clapped. Mac stepped back. "So God listens to funk?" Mac had never heard funk talked about in any properly righteous terms. "I thought you'd be listening to George Beverly Shea or the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, something churchier." "Now, see here, Mackenzie, you don't have to be looking out for me. I listen to everything, and not just to the music itself, but the hearts behind it. Don't you remember your seminary classes? These kids ain't just saying anything I haven't heard before. They're just full of vinegar and fizz. Lots of anger, and I must say with some good reason, too. They're just some of my kids, showing and spouting off. I'm especially fond of those boys. Yep, I've been keeping my eye on them." Max struggled to keep up with her, to make some sense of what was happening. None of his old seminary training was helping in the least. He was at a sudden loss for words, and his million questions had all seemed to abandon him, so he stated the obvious. "You must know," he offered, "calling you Papa is a bit of a stretch for me." "Oh, really?" She looked at him in mock surprise. "Of course I know. I always know," she chuckled. "But tell me, why do you think it's hard for you? Is it because it's too familiar for you, or maybe because I'm showing myself as a woman, a mother, or—" "No small issue there," Mac interrupted with an awkward chuckle. "Or maybe it's because of the failure of your own papa." Matt gasped involuntarily. He wasn't used to having deep secrets surface so quickly and openly. Instantly, guilt and anger welled up, and he wanted to lash out with a sarcastic remark in response. Mac felt as if he were dangling over a bottomless chasm and was afraid if he let any of it out, he would lose control of everything. He sought for safe footing, but was only partially successful, finally answering through gritted teeth. "Maybe it's because I've never known anyone I could really call Papa." At that, she put down the mixing bowl that had been cradling her arm, and leaving the wooden spoon in it, she turned toward Mac with tender eyes. She didn't have to say it. He knew she understood what was going on inside of him, and somehow he knew she cared about him more than anyone ever had. "If you let me, Mac, I'd be the Papa you never had." The offer was at once inviting and at the same time repulsive. He had always wanted a Papa he could trust, but he wasn't sure he'd find it here, especially if this one couldn't even protect his Missy. A long silence hung between them. Mac was uncertain what to say, and she was in no hurry to let the moment pass easily. "If you couldn't take care of Missy, how can I trust you to take care of me?" There he had said it, the question that had tormented him every day of the great sadness. Mac felt his face flush angry red as he stared at what he now considered to be some odd characterization of God, and he realized his hands were knotted into fists. "Mac, I'm so sorry." Tears began to trail down her cheeks. "I know what a great gulf this has put between us. I know you don't understand this yet, but I am especially fond of Missy, and you too." He loved the way she said Missy's name, yet he hated it coming from her. It rolled off her tongue like the sweetest wine, and even through all the fury still raging in his mind, he somehow knew she meant it. He wanted to believe her, and slowly some of his rage began to subside. "That's why you're here, Mac," she continued. "I want to heal the wound that grew inside of you and between us." To gain some control, he turned his eyes towards the floor. It was a full minute before he had enough to whisper without looking up. "I think I like that," he admitted, "but I don't see how." "Honey, there's no easy answer that would take your pain away. Believe me, if I had one, I'd use it now. I have no magic wand to wave over you and make it all better. Life takes a bit of time and a lot of relationship." Mac was glad they were stepping back from the edge of his ugly accusation. It had scared him how near he had come to being totally overwhelmed by it. "I think it'd be easier to have this conversation if you weren't wearing a dress," he suggested and attempted to smile, as weak as it was. "If it were easier, then I wouldn't be," she said with a slight giggle. "I'm not trying to make this harder for either of us, but this is a good place to start. I often find that getting head issues out of the way first makes the heart stuff easier to work on later, when you're ready." She picked up the wooden spoon again, dripping with some sort of batter. Mackenzie, I am neither male nor female, even though both genders are derived from my nature. If I choose to appear to you as a man or a woman, it's because I love you. For me to appear to you as a woman and suggest that you call me Papa is simply to mix metaphors, to help you keep from falling so easily back into your religious conditioning. She leaned forward as if to share a secret. To reveal myself to you as a very large, white grandfather figure with flowing beard like Gandalf will simply reinforce your religious stereotypes, and this weekend is not about reinforcing your religious stereotypes. Mac almost laughed out loud and wanted to say, "You think? I'm over here barely believing that I'm not stark raving mad." Instead, he focused on what she had just said and regained his composure. He believed in his head at least that God was a spirit, neither male nor female, but in spite of all of that, he was embarrassed to admit to himself that all his visuals of God were very white and very male. She stopped talking, but only long enough to put away some seasonings in a spice rack on a ledge by the window, and then turned to face him again. She looked at Mac intently. "Hasn't it always been a problem for you to embrace me as your father? And after what you've been through, you couldn't very well handle a father right now, could you?" He knew she was right, and he realized the kindness and compassion in what she was doing. Somehow, the way she had approached him had skirted his resistance to her love. It was strange and painful, maybe even a little bit wonderful. But then he paused, still focused on staying rational. "Why is there such an emphasis on you being a father? I mean, it seems to be the way you most reveal yourself." "Well," responded Papa, turning away from him and bustling around the kitchen, "there are many reasons for that, and some of them go very deep. Let me say for now that we knew once the creation was broken, true fathering would be much more lacking than mothering. Don't misunderstand me, both are needed, but emphasis on fathering is necessary because of the enormity of its absence." Mac turned away a bit bewildered, feeling he was already in over his head. As he reflected, he looked through the window at a wild-looking garden. "You knew I would come, didn't you?" Mac finally spoke quietly. "Of course I did." She was busy again, her back to him. "Then was I free not to come? Did I not have a choice in the matter?" Papa turned back to face him, now with flour and dough in her hands. "Good question. How deep would you like to go?" She didn't wait for a response, knowing that Mac didn't have one. Instead, she said, "Do you believe you're free to leave?" "I suppose I am." "Am I?" "Of course you are. I'm not interested in prisoners. You're free to walk out that door right now and go home to your empty house. Or you could go down to the grind and hang out with Willie. Just because I know you're too curious to go, does that reduce your freedom to leave?" She paused only briefly and then turned back to her task, talking to him over her shoulder. "Or if you want to go just a wee bit deeper, we could talk about the nature of freedom itself. Does freedom mean that you're allowed to do whatever you want to do? Or we could talk about all the limiting influences in your life that actively work against your freedom. Your family genetic heritage, your specific DNA, your metabolic uniqueness, the quantum stuff that is going on a subatomic level where only I am the always present observer, or the intrusion of your soul's sickness that inhibits and binds you, or the social influences around you, or the habits that have created synaptic bonds and pathways in your brain. And then there's advertising, propaganda, and paradigms. Inside that confluence of multifaceted inhibitors," she signed. "What is freedom, really?" Mac just stood there not knowing what to say. "Only I can set you free, Mackenzie, but freedom can never be forced." "I don't understand," replied Mac. "I don't even understand what you just told me." She turned back and smiled. "I know. I didn't tell you so that you would understand right now. I told you for later. At this point, you don't even comprehend that freedom is an incremental process." Gently reaching out, she took Mac's hands in her, flour covered and all, and looking him straight in the eyes, she continued, "Mackenzie, the truth shall set you free, and the truth has a name. He's over in the woodshop right now covered in sawdust. Everything is about him. And freedom is a process that happens inside a relationship with him. Then all that stuff you feel churning around inside will start to work its way out." "How can you really know how I feel?" Mac asked, looking back into her eyes. Papa didn't answer, only looked down at their hands. His gaze followed hers, and for the first time, Mac noticed the scars in her wrists, like those he now assumed Jesus also had on his. She allowed him to tenderly touch the scars, outlines of a deep piercing, and he finally looked up again into her eyes. Tears were slowly making their way down her face, little pathways through the flour that dusted her cheeks. Don't ever think that what my son chose to do didn't cost us dearly. Love always leaves a significant mark," she stated softly and gently. "We were there together." Mac was surprised. "At the cross? Now wait, I thought you loved him, you know. My God, why hast thou forsaken me?" It was a scripture that had often haunted Mac in the great sadness. You misunderstand the mystery there. Regardless of what he felt at that moment, I never left him. How can you say that? You abandoned him just like you abandoned me. "Mackenzie, I never left him, and I've never left you. That makes no sense to me, he snapped. I know it doesn't, at least not yet. Will you at least consider this? When all you can see is your pain, perhaps then you lose sight of me? When Mac did not respond, she turned back to her cooking so as to offer him a little needed space. She seemed to be preparing a number of dishes all at once, adding various spices and ingredients. Humming a haunting little tune, she put the finishing touches on the pie that she'd been making and slid into the oven. Don't forget, the story didn't end in a sense of forsakenness. He found his way through it to put himself completely into my hands. Oh, what a moment that was. Mac leaned against the counter somewhat bewildered. His emotions and thoughts were all jumbled. Part of him wanted to believe everything Papa was saying. That would be nice, but another part was objecting rather loudly. This can't possibly be true. Papa reached for the kitchen timer, gave it a little twist, and placed it on the table in front of them. It's not who you think I am, Mackenzie. Her words weren't angry or defensive. Mac looked at her, looked at the timer, and sighed. I feel totally lost. Then let's see if we can find you in this mess. Almost as if on cue, a blue jay landed on the kitchen windowsill and began strutting back and forth. Papa reached into the tin on the counter and sliding the window open, offered Mr. J a mixture of grains that she must have kept just for that purpose. Without any hesitation, and with a seeming air of humility and thankfulness, the bird walked straight to her hand and began feeding. Consider our little bird here, she began. Most birds were created to fly. Being grounded for them is a limitation within their ability to fly, not the other way around. She paused to let Mac think about her statement. You, on the other hand, were created to be loved. So for you to live as if you were unloved is a limitation, not the other way around. Mac nodded his head, not so much in full agreement, but more as a signal at least he understood was tracking. That seemed simple enough. Living unloved is like clipping a bird's wings and removing its ability to fly. Not something I want for you. There's a rub. He didn't feel particularly loved at the moment. Mac, pain has a way of clipping our wings and keeping us from being able to fly. She waited a moment, allowing her words to settle. And if left unresolved for very long, you can almost forget that you were ever created to fly in the first place. Mac was silent. Strangely, the silence was not that uncomfortable. Mac looked at the little bird. The bird looked back at Mac. He wondered if it was possible for birds to smile. At least Mr. J looked like he was, perhaps if only sympathetically. I'm not like you, Mac. It wasn't a put down, it was a simple statement of fact. But to Mac, it felt like a splash of cold water. I am God. I am who I am, and like you, my wings can't be clipped. Well, that's wonderful for you, but where exactly does that leave me? Mac blurted out, sounding more irritated than he would have liked. Papa began stroking the little bird, brought him up close to her face, and said, smack dab in the center of my love, as the two cuddled nose to beak. I'm thinking that Bert probably understands that better than I do, was the best Mac could offer. I know, honey. That's why we're here. Why do you think I said I'm not like you? Well, I really have no idea. I mean, you're God and I'm not. He couldn't keep the sarcasm out of his voice, but she ignored it completely. Yes, but not exactly. At least not in the way you're thinking. Mackenzie, I am what some would say holy, and holy, WHOLLY, other than you. The problem is that many folks try to grasp some sense of who I am by taking the best version of themselves, projecting that to the nth degree, factoring in all the goodness they can perceive, which often isn't much, and then call that God. And while it may seem like a noble effort, the truth is that it falls pitifully short of who I really am. I'm not merely the best version of you that you think you can, I'm not merely the best version of you that you can think of. I am far more than that, above and beyond all that you can ask or think. I'm sorry, but those are just words to me. They don't make much sense, Max shrugged. Even though you can't finally grasp me, guess what? I still want to be known. You're talking about Jesus, right? Is this going to be a let's try to understand the Trinity sort of thing? She chuckled. Sort of, but this isn't Sunday school. This is a flying lesson. Mackenzie, as you might imagine, there are some advantages to being God. By nature, I am completely unlimited, without bounds. I've always known fullness. I live in a state of perpetual satisfaction as my normal state of existence, she said, quite pleased. Just one of the perks of me being me. That made Max smile. This lady was fully enjoying herself all by herself, and there wasn't an ounce of arrogance to spoil it. We created you to share in that, but then Adam chose to go it on his own, as we knew he would, and everything got messed up. But instead of scrapping the whole creation, we rolled up our sleeves and entered in the middle of the mess. That's what we have done in Jesus. Mac was hanging in there, trying his best to follow her train of thought. When we three spoke ourselves into human existence as the Son of God, we became fully human. We also chose to embrace all the limitations that this entailed. Even though we have always been present in this created universe, we now became flesh and blood. It would be like this bird, whose nature it is to fly, choosing only to walk and remain grounded. He doesn't stop being the bird, but it does alter his experience of life significantly. She paused to make sure Mac was still tracking. While there was a definite cramp forming in his brain, he voiced an okay, inviting her to continue. Although by nature he is fully God, Jesus is fully human and lives as such. While never losing the innate ability to fly, he chooses moment by moment to remain grounded. That is why his name is Emmanuel, God with us, or God with you, to be more precise. Well, what about all the miracles, the healings, raising people from the dead? Doesn't that prove that Jesus is God, more than human? No, it proves that Jesus is truly human. What? Mackenzie, I can fly, but humans can't. Jesus is fully human, although he is also fully God, but he has never drawn upon his nature as God to do anything. He has only lived out of his relationship with me, living in the very same manner that I desire to be in relationship with every human being. He's just the first to do he is just the first to do it to the uttermost, the first to absolutely trust my life within him, the first to believe in my love and my goodness without regard for appearance or consequence. So when he healed the blind, he did so as a dependent, limited human being, trusting in my life and power to be at work within him and through him. Jesus, as a human being, had no power with himself to heal anyone. That came as a surprise to Mac's religious system. Only as he rested on his relationship with me, in our communion, our co-union, could he express my heart and will into any given circumstance. So when you look at Jesus and it appears that he's flying, he really is flying. But what you're actually seeing is me, my life in him. That's how he lives and acts as a true human, how every human is designed to live, out of my life. A bird's not defined by being grounded, but by his ability to fly. Remember this. Humans are not defined by their limitations, but by the intentions that I have for them. Not by what they seem to be, but by everything it means to be created in my image. Mac felt the onset of information overload, so he pulled up a chair and just sat down. This would take some time to comprehend. So, does this mean that you were limited when Jesus was on earth? I mean, did you limit yourself only to Jesus? Not at all. Although I've only been limited in Jesus, I've never been limited in myself. There's that whole Trinity thing, which is where I kind of get lost. Papa laughed a long, rich belly laugh that made Mac want to join in. She set the little bird down on the table next to Mac, turned to open the oven, and gave the pie that was baking a quick little look. Satisfied that everything was fine, Papa then put up the chair alongside them. Mac looked at the little bird, who amazingly was content to just sit there with him. The absurdity of it all gave Mac a chuckle. To begin with, that you can't grasp the wonder of my nature is rather a good thing. Who wants to worship a God who can be fully comprehended, eh? Not much mystery in that. But what difference does it make that there are three of you and you're all one God? Did I say that right? Right enough, she grinned. Mackenzie, it makes all the difference in the world. She seemed to be enjoying this. We're not three gods, and we're not talking about one God with three attitudes, like a man who's a husband, father, and worker. I am one God, and I am three persons, and each of the three is fully, entirely the one. The huh? Mac having surprised and finally surfaced in all his glory. Never mind that, she continued. What's important is this. If I were simply one God and only one person, then you will find yourself in this creation without something wonderful, without something essential even, and I would be utterly other than I am, and we would be without... Mac didn't even know how to finish the question. Love and relationship. All love and relationship is possible for you only because it already exists within me, within God myself. Love is not the limitation. Love is a flying. I am love. As if in response to her declaration, the timer dinged and the little bird took off and flew out the window. Watching the jay in flight took on a whole new level of delight. He turned back to Papa and just stared at him in wonder. She was so beautiful and astonishing. Even though he was feeling a little lost, even though the great sadness still attended him, he found himself settling down somewhat into the safety of being close to her. You do understand, she continued, that unless I had an object to love, or more accurately, a someone to love, if I did not have such a relationship within myself, then I would not be capable of love at all. You would have a God who could not love, or maybe worse, you would have a God who, when he chose, could only love as a limitation of his nature. That kind of God could possibly act without love, and that would be a disaster. And that is surely not me. With that, God stood up, went to the oven door, pulled out the freshly baked pie, set it on the counter, and turning around as if to present herself, said, the God who is the one that the I am who I am cannot act apart from love. Mac knew that what he was hearing, as hard as it was to understand, was something amazing, incredible. It was as if her words were wrapping themselves around him, embracing him and speaking to him in ways beyond just what he could hear. Not that he actually believed any of it, if only if it were true. His experience told him otherwise. This weekend is about relationship and love. Now, I know you have a lot you want to talk to me about, but right now you better go wash up. The other two are on their way in for supper. She began to walk away, but paused and turned back. Mackenzie, I know that your heart is full of pain and anger and a lot of confusion. Together, you and I, we'll get around to some of that while you're here. But I also want you to know that there's more going on than you can imagine or understand, even if I told you. As much as you're able, rest in what trust you have in me, no matter how small, okay? Mac had lowered his head and was looking at the floor. She knows, he thought. Small. His little must be barely to the right of none. Nodding agreement, he looked up and noticed again the scars on her wrists. Papa, Mac finally said in a way that felt very awkward, but he was trying. Yes, honey? Mac struggled for the words to tell her what was in his heart. I'm so sorry that Jesus had to die. She walked around the table and gave Mac another big hug. I know you are, and thank you, but you need to know that we aren't sorry at all. It was worth it. Isn't that right, son? She turned to ask her a question of Jesus, who had just entered the cabin. Absolutely. He paused and then looked at Mac. And I would have done it even if it were only for you. But it wasn't, he said with an inviting grin. Mac excused himself and found the bathroom, where he washed his hands and his face and tried to collect himself. All right, chapter 7, God on the Dock. I think I'll read 2 more pages and then call it quits for now. Max stood in the bathroom. Oh, God on the Dock. Let me quote C.S. Lewis here. Let's pray that the human race never escapes Earth to spread its iniquity elsewhere. C.S. Lewis. Max stood in the bathroom, looking into the mirror while wiping his face dry with a towel. He was searching for some sign of insanity in those eyes staring back at him. Was this real? Of course not. It was impossible. But then he reached out his hand and slowly touched the mirror. Maybe this was a hallucination brought on by all his grief and despair. Maybe it was a dream and he was asleep somewhere. Maybe in the shack freezing to death. Maybe. Suddenly, a terrible crash broke into his reverie. It came from the direction of the kitchen, and Mac froze. For a moment, there was dead silence, and then unexpectedly, he heard uproarious laughter. Curious, he exited the bathroom and poked his head through the doorway of the kitchen. Mac was shocked at the scene in front of him. It appeared that Jesus had dropped a large bowl of some sort of batter or sauce on the floor, and it was everywhere. It must have landed close to Papa because the lower portion of her skirt and bare feet were covered in the gooey mess. All three were laughing so hard that Mac didn't think they were breathing. Saria said something about humans being clumsy, and all three started roaring again. Finally, Jesus brushed past Mac and returned a minute later with a large basin of water and towels. Saria had already started wiping the goop from the floor and his cupboards, but Jesus went straight to Papa and, kneeling at her feet, began to wipe off the front of her clothes. He worked down to her feet and gently lifted 1 foot at a time, which he directed in the basin where he cleaned and massaged. Oh, that felt so good, exclaimed Papa as she continued her task at the counter. As he leaned against the doorway watching, Mac's mind was full of thoughts. So this was God in a relationship? It was beautiful and so appealing. He knew that it didn't matter whose fault it was. The mess from some bowl had been broken, that a dish had been planned would not be shared. Obviously, what was truly important here was the love they had for one another and the fullness it brought them. He shook his head. How different this was from the way he treated the ones he loved. Supper was simple, but a feast nonetheless. Roast bird of some kind in an orangey, mango-y kind of sauce, fresh vegetables spiced with who, but God knows what, all fruity and gingery, tangy and peppery. Rice, the quality of which Mac had never tasted before, could have been a meal by itself. The only awkward part was at the very beginning when Mac, out of habit, bowed his head before he remembered where he was. He looked up to find all three of them all grinning at him. So as nonchalantly as he could, he asked, thank you all. Could I have a bit of that rice there? Sure, we were gonna have this incredible Japanese sauce, but Greasy Fingers over there, Papa nodded toward Jesus, decided to see if it would bounce. Come on now, Jesus responded in mock defense. My hands are slippery. What can I say? Papa winked at Mac as she passed him the rice. You just can't get good help around here. Everyone laughed. Conversation seemed almost normal. Mac was asked about each of the children, except Missy, and he talked about their various struggles and triumphs. When he spoke of his concerns for Kate, the three only nodded with concerned expressions, but offered him no counsel or wisdom. He also answered questions about his friends, and Saria seemed more interested in asking about Nan. Finally, Mac blurted out something that had been bothering him throughout the discussion. Now, here I'm telling you about my kids and my friends and about Nan, but you already know everything that I'm telling you, don't you? You're acting like it's the first time you heard it. Saria reached across the table and shook his hand. Mackenzie, remember our conversation earlier about limitation? Our conversation? He glanced over at Papa, who was nodding knowingly. You can't share with one and not share with us all, Saria said and smiled. Remember that choosing to stay on the ground is a choice to facilitate a relationship, to honor it. Mackenzie, you do this yourself. You don't play a game or color a picture with a child to show your superiority. Rather, you choose to limit yourself so as to facilitate and honor that relationship. You will even lose the competition to accomplish love. It is not about winning and losing, but about love and respect. So, when I'm telling you about my children, we have limited ourselves out of respect for you. We're not bringing to mind, as it were, our knowledge of your children. As we're listening to you, it is as if this is the first time we have known about them, and we take great delight in seeing them through your eyes. I like that, reflected Max, sitting back in his chair. Saria squeezed his hand and seemed to sit back. I do too. Relationships are never about power, and one way to avoid the will to power is to choose to limit oneself, to serve. Humans often do this. In touching the infirm and sick, in serving the ones whose minds have left to wander, in relating to the poor, in loving the very old and the very young, or even caring for other who has assumed a position of power over them. Well spoken, Saria, said Papa, her face beaming with pride. I take care of the dishes later, but first I would like to have a time of devotion. Mac had to suppress his snicker the thought of God having devotions. Images of family devotions from his childhood came spilling in his mind. Not exactly good memories. Often it was tedious and a boring exercise in coming up with the right answers. Or rather, the same old answers to the same old Bible story questions, and then trying to stay awake during his father's excruciatingly long prayers. And when his father had been drinking, family devotions devolved into a terrifying minefield where any wrong answer or any errant glance could trigger an explosion. He half expected Jesus to pull out a huge old King James Bible. Instead, Jesus reached across the table and took Papa's hands in his, scars now clearly visible on his wrists. Max sat transfixed as he watched Jesus kiss his father's hands and then look deep in his father's eyes and finally say, Papa, I loved watching you today as you made yourself fully available to take Max's pain into yourself and then gave him space to choose his own timing. You honored him and you honored me. To listen to you whisper love and calm into his heart was truly incredible. What a joy to watch. I love being your son. Although Mac felt like he was intruding, no one else seemed concerned, and he really had no idea where he would have gone in any case. To be in the presence of such love expressed seemed to dislodge an inner emotional logjam. And while he didn't understand exactly what he felt, it was good. What was he witnessing? Something simple, warm, intimate, genuine. This was holy. Holiness had always been a cold and sterile concept to Mac, but this was neither. Concerned that any movement on his part might shatter the moment, he simply closed his eyes and folded his hands in front of him. Listening intently with his eyes shut, he heard Jesus move in his chair. There was a pause before he spoke again. Saria, Jesus began softly and tenderly, you wash, I dry. Mac's eyes snapped open in time to see the two smiling broadly at each other, picking up the dishes and disappearing into the kitchen. He sat for a few minutes, unsure about what to do. Papa had gone somewhere, and now that the other two were busy with dishes, well, it was an easy decision. He picked up silverware and glasses and he headed for the kitchen. As soon as he put them down for Saria to wash, Jesus tossed him a dish towel and they both began drying. Saria began humming the same evocative tune he had heard earlier with Papa, and Jesus and Mac simply listened as they worked. More than once, the melody stirred Mac deep inside, knocking again at the door. To him, it sounded Gaelic, and he could almost hear breath pipes in accompaniment. But as difficult as it was for Mac to stay and allow his emotions to well up so powerfully, the melody absolutely captured him. If he could keep listening to her, he would be thrilled to do dishes the rest of his life. 10 minutes or so later, they were finished. Jesus kissed Saria on the cheek, and she disappeared around the corner. He then turned and smiled at Mac. Let's go out on the dock and look at the stars. What about the others? Mac asked. I'm here, replied Jesus. I'm always here. Mac nodded. This presence is a God thing. Although hard to grasp, seemed to be steadily penetrating past his mind into his heart. He let it go at that. Come on, said Jesus, interrupting Mac's thoughts. I know you enjoy looking at the stars. Want to? He sounded just like a child full of anticipation and expectancy. Yeah, I think so, answered Mac, realizing that the last time he had done was on the ill-fated camping trip with the kids. Maybe it was time to take a few risks. He followed Jesus out the back door. In the waning moments of twilight, Mac could make out the rocky shore of the lake, not overgrown as you remember, but beautifully kept and picture perfect. The nearby creek seemed to be humming some sort of musical tone. Protruding about 50 feet into the lake was a dock, and Mac could barely make out 3 canoes tied at intervals along its course. Night was falling quickly, and the distant darkness was already thick with the sounds of crickets and bullfrogs. Jesus took his arm and led him up the path while his eyes adjusted. But already Mac was looking up into the moonless night at the wonder of the emerging stars. They made their way 3/4 up the dock and lay down on their backs looking up. The elevation of this place seemed to magnify the heavens, and Mac reveled in seeing stars in such numbers and clarity. Jesus suggested that they close their eyes for a few minutes, allowing the last effects of dusk to disappear from the night. Matt complied, and when he finally opened his eyes, the sight was so powerful that he experienced vertigo for a few seconds. It almost felt like he was falling up into space, the stars racing toward him as if to embrace him. He lifted his hands, imagining that he could reach out and pluck diamonds, one by one, off of a velvet black sky. Wow, he whispered. Incredible, whispered Jesus, his head near Max in the darkness. I never get tired of this. Even though you created it, Mac asked. I created it as a word, before the word became flesh. So even though I created this, I see it now as a human. And I must say, it is impressive. It certainly is. Mac was not sure how to describe what he felt, but as he continued to lie in silence, gazing into the celestial display, watching and listening, he knew in his heart that this too was holy. As they both watched in awestruck wonder, shooting stars would occasionally blaze a brief trail across the night blackness, causing one or the other to exclaim, Did you see that? Awesome. After a particularly long silence, Max spoke. I feel more comfortable around you. You seem so different than the other two. How do you mean different? Came his soft voice out of the darkness. Well, Mac paused as he thought about it. More real or tangible, I don't know. He struggled with the words and Jesus lay quiet waiting. It's like I've always known you, but Papa isn't at all what I expected from God. And Saria, she's way out there. Jesus chuckled in the dark. Since I am human, we have much in common to begin with, but I still don't understand. I'm the best way any human can relate to Papa or Sarayu. To see me is to see them. To love you, sense from me, is no different from how they love you. And believe me, Papa and Sarayu are just as real as I am. Though, as you have seen, in far different ways. Speaking of Sarayu, is she the Holy Spirit? Yes, she is creativity. She is action. She is a breathing of life. She is much more. She is my spirit. And her name, Sarayu? That is a simple name from one of our human languages. It means wind, a common wind, actually. She loves that name. Grunted Mac. Nothing too common about her. True that, responded Jesus. And the name Papa mentioned, Elucia. The voice spoke reverently from the dark next to him. That is a wonderful name. El is my name as creator God, but Usia, O-U-S-I-A, is being, or that which is truly real. So the name means the creator God who is truly real and the ground of all being. Now that is also a beautiful name. There was a silence for a minute while Mac pondered what Jesus had said. So then, where does that leave us? He felt as he was asking the question for the entire human race. Right where you were always intended to be, in the very center of our love and our purpose. Again, pausing. I suppose I can live with that. Jesus chuckled. I'm glad you hear that. And they both laughed. Neither spoke for a time. Stillness has fallen like a blanket, and all Mac was really aware of was the sound of water lapping up against the dock. It was he who eventually broke the silence again. Jesus? Yes, Mackenzie? I'm surprised by one thing about you. Really? What? I guess I expected you to be more... Be careful here, Mac. Humanly striking. Jesus chuckled. Humanly striking? You mean handsome? Now he was laughing. Well, I was trying to avoid that, but yes, somehow I thought you'd be the ideal man, athletic and overwhelmingly good looking. It's my nose, isn't it? Mac didn't know what to say. Jesus laughed. I'm Jewish, My grandfather on my mother's side had a big nose. In fact, most of the men on my mom's side had big noses. I just thought you'd be better looking. By whose standards? Anyway, once you really get to know me, it won't matter to you. The words, though delivered kindly, stunned. Stunned what exactly? Mac lay there a few seconds and realized that as much as he thought he knew Jesus, perhaps he didn't. Not really. Maybe what he knew was an icon, an ideal, image through which he tried to grasp a sense of spirituality, but not a real person. Why is that? He finally asked. You said if I really knew, it wouldn't matter what you looked like. It is quite simple, really. Being always transcends appearance, that which only seems to be. Once you begin to know the being behind the very pretty or very ugly face, as determined by your bias, the surface appearances fade away until they simply no longer matter. That is why Lucia has such a wonderful name. God, who is the ground of all beings, dwells in, around, and through all things, ultimately emerging as the real, and any appearances that mask that reality will fall away. Silence followed as Mac wrestled with what Jesus had said. He gave up after only a minute or two and decided to ask the riskier question. You said I don't really know you. It would be a lot easier if we could always talk like this. Admittedly, Mac, this is special. You were really stuck and we wanted to help you crawl out of your pain. But don't think that just because I'm not visible, our relationship has to be less real. It will be different, but perhaps even more real. How is that? My purpose from the beginning was to live in you and you in me. Wait a minute. How can that happen? If you're still fully human, how can you be inside of me? Astounding, isn't it? It's Papa's miracle. It's the power of Saria, my spirit, the spirit of God who restores the union that was lost so long ago. Me, I choose to live moment by moment fully human. I am fully God, but I'm human to the core. Like I said, it's Papa's miracle. Mac was lying in the darkness, listening intently. Are you talking about real indwelling, not just some positional theological thing? Of course, answered Jesus, his voice strong and sure, is what everything is all about. The human, formed out of the physical material creation, can once more be fully indwelt by spiritual life, my life. It requires that a very real, dynamic, and active union exists. That is almost unbelievable, Mac exclaimed quietly. I had no idea. I need to think more about this, but I might have a lot more questions. And we have your lifetime to sort through them, Jesus chuckled. But enough of that for now. Let's get lost in the starry night. In the silence that followed, Max simply lay still, allowing the immensity of space and scattered light to dwarf him, letting his perceptions be captured by starlight and the thought that everything was about him, about the human race, that all of this was all for us. After what seemed like a long time, it was Jesus who broke into the quiet. I never get tired of looking at this, the wonder of it all, the wastefulness of creation, as one of our brothers has called it. So elegant, so full of longing and beauty even now. You know, Mac responded, suddenly struck anew by the absurdity of the situation, where he was, the person next to him. Sometimes you sound so, here I'm lying next to God Almighty, and you really sound so human, Jesus offered, but ugly. And with that, he began to chuckle, quietly and restrained at first. But after a couple of snorts, laughter simply started tumbling out. It was infectious, and Mac found himself swept alone from somewhere deep inside. He had not laughed from down there in a long time. Jesus reached over and hugged him, shaking from his own spasm of mirth. And Mac felt more clean and alive and well than he had since, well, he couldn't remember since when. Eventually, they both calmed again, and the night's quiet asserted itself once more. It seemed that even the frogs had caught it quits. Mac lay there realizing that he was now feeling guilty about enjoying himself, about laughing. And even in the darkness, he could feel the great sadness rolling in over him. Jesus, he whispered as his voice choked, I feel so lost. A hand reached out and squeezed his, and didn't let go. I know, Mac, but it's not true. I am with you, and I'm not lost. I'm sorry it feels that way, but hear me clearly. You are not lost. I hope you're right, Max said, his tension lessened by the words of his newfound friend. Come on, said Jesus, standing up and reaching down for Mac. You have a big day ahead of you. Let's get you to bed. He put his arm around Mac's shoulder, and suddenly they walked back toward the cabin. Mac was suddenly exhausted. Today had been one long day. Maybe he would wake up at home in his own bed after a night of vivid dreaming, but somewhere inside, he hoped he was wrong. Okay, so I did finish reading chapter 7. Chapter 8, let me just read a few minutes from here. Chapter 8, A Breakfast of Champions. Quote is, growth means change, and change involves risk, stepping from the known to the unknown. Growth means change, and change involves risk, stepping from the known to the unknown. Quoted by author unknown. When he reached his room, Mac discovered that his clothes, which he had left back in the car, were either folded atop his dresser or hung in the open closet. To his amusement, he also found a Gideon's Bible in the nightstand. He opened the window wide to let the outside night flow freely in, something that Nan never tolerated at home because there were fear of spiders and anything else crawly and creepy. Snuggling like a small child deep inside the heavy down comforter, he only made it through a couple of verses before the Bible somehow left his hand. The light somehow turned off. Someone kissed him on the cheek, and he was lifting gently off the ground in flying dream. Those who have never flown this way might think those who believe they do rather daft, but secretly they're probably at least a little envious. He hadn't had a flying dream in years, not since the great sadness had descended. But tonight, Mac flew high into the starlit night, the air clear and cool, but not uncomfortable. He soared above lakes and rivers, crossing ocean coasts and a number of reef-rimmed islets. As odd as it sounds, Mac had learned inside his dreams to fly like this, to lift off the ground supported by nothing, no wings, no aircraft of any sort, just himself. Beginning flights were usually limited a few inches, due mostly to fear, or more accurately, a dread of falling. Stretching his flights to a foot or two and eventually higher increased his confidence, as did his discovery that crashing wasn't painful at all, but only a slow motion bounce. In time, he learned to ascend into the clouds, cover vast distances, and lean gently. As he soared at will over rugged mountains and crystal white seashores, Reveling in the mist wonder of dream flight, suddenly something grabbed him by the ankle and tore him out of the sky. In a matter of seconds, he was dragged from the heights and violently thrown face first onto a muddy and deeply rutted road. Thunder shook the ground and rain instantly drenched him to the bone. And there it came again, lightning illuminating the face of his daughter as she soundlessly screamed, "Daddy," and then turned to run into the darkness, her red dress visible only for a few brief flashes and then gone. He fought with all his strength to extricate himself from the mud and the water, only succeeding in being sucked deeper into his grasp. And just as he's been taken, entered, he woke with a gasp. With his heart racing and his imagination anchored in the nightmare's images, it took a few moments for Mac to realize it had only been a dream. But even as it faded from his consciousness, the emotions didn't go with it. The dream had provoked the great sadness, and before he could even get out of bed, he was once again fighting his way through the despair that had devoured too many of his days. With a grimace, he looked around the room in the dull gray of the growing dawn that snuck in around the window shades. This wasn't his bedroom. Nothing looked or felt familiar. What was he? Think, Mac, think. Then he remembered. He was still at the shack with those three interesting characters, all of whom thought they were God. This can't really be happening, Matt grunted as he pulled his feet out of bed and sat on his edge with his head in his hands. He thought back to the previous day and again entertained the fear that he was going crazy. As he had never been much of a touchy-feeling person, Papa, whomever she was, made him nervous and he had no idea what to make of Sarayu. He admitted to himself that he liked Jesus a lot, but he seemed the least godlike of the three. He let out a deep, heavy sigh. And if God were really here, why hadn't he taken his nightmares away? Sitting in quandary, he decided, wasn't helping. So he found his way to the bathroom, where to his amusement, everything he needed for a shower had been carefully laid out for him. He took his time in the warmth of the water, took his time shaving, and back in the bedroom, took his time dressing. The penetrating and alluring aroma of coffee drew his eyes to the steaming cup waiting for him on the end table by the door. Taking a sip, he opened the shades and stood looking out through his bedroom window onto the lake, which he had only glimpsed as a shadow the night before. It was perfect, smooth as glass, except for the occasional trout leaping after his breakfast, sending circles of miniature waves radiating across the deep blue surface until they were slowly absorbed back into the larger surface. He estimated the far side was about half a mile away. Dew sparkled everywhere, diamond-like tears of the early morning reflecting the sun's love. The three canoes resting easily at intervals along the dock looked inviting, but Max shrugged off the thought. Canoes were no longer a joy. Too many bad memories. The dock reminded him of the night before. Had he really lain out there with the one who made the universe? Mac shook his head, dumbfounded. What was going on here? Who were they really, and what did they want from him? Whomever it was, he was sure he didn't have it to give. The smell of eggs and bacon mixed with something else curled in his room, interrupting his thoughts. Mac decided it was time to emerge and speak for his share. As he entered the main living area, he heard the sound of a familiar Bruce Cockburn tune drifting from the kitchen and the high-pitched black woman singing along rather well. Oh, love that fires the sun keep me burning. Papa emerged with placing each handful of pancakes and fried potatoes and greens of some sort. She was dressed in a long-flowing, African-looking garment, complete with a vibrant, multicolored headband. She looked radiant, almost glowing. You know, she exclaimed, I love that child's songs. I'm especially fond of Bruce, you know. She looked over at Mac, who was just sitting down at the table. Mac nodded, his appetite increasing by the second. Yep, she continued, and I know you like him too. Mac smiled. It was true. Cockburn had been a family favorite for years. First his, then his and Nan's, and then each of the children to one degree or another. So, honey, Papa asked, continuing busily with whatever she was doing, how were your dreams last night? Dreams are sometimes important, you know. They can be a way of opening up windows and letting the bad air out. Mac knew this was an invitation to unlock the door into his terrors. By the moment, he wasn't ready to invite her into that hole with him. I slept fine, thank you, he responded, and then quickly changed the subject. Is he your favorite? Bruce, I mean? She stopped and looked at him. Mackenzie, I have no favorites. I am just especially fond of him. You seem to be especially fond of a lot of people, Mac observed with a suspicious look. Are there any who you are not especially fond of? She lifted her head and rolled her eyes as if she were mentally going through the catalog of every being ever created. Nope, I haven't been able to find any. Guess that's just the way it is. Mac was interested. Do you ever get mad at any of them? Sure enough, what parent doesn't? There's a lot to be mad about in the mess my kids have made and the mess they're in. I don't like a lot of choices they make, but that anger, especially for me, is an expression of love all the same. I love the ones I'm angry with just as much as those I'm not. But, Mac paused, what about your wrath? It seems to me that if you're going to pretend to be God Almighty, you need to be a lot angrier. Do I now? That's what I think. Weren't you always running around killing people in the Bible? You just don't seem to fit the bill. I understand how disoriented all this must be for you, Mac, but the only one pretending here is you. I am what I am. I'm not trying to fit anyone's bill. But you're asking me to believe that you're God, and I just don't see. Mac had no idea how to finish the sentence. He just gave up. I'm not asking you to believe anything, but I will tell you that you're going to find this day a lot easier if you simply accept what it is instead of trying to fit it into your preconceived notions. But if you're God, aren't you the one spilling out great vials of wrath and throwing people in a burning lake of fire? Mac could feel his deep anger emerging again, pushing out the question in front of it. And he was a little chagrined at his own lack of self-control, but he asked anyway, honestly, don't you enjoy punishing those who disappoint you? At that, Papa stopped her preparations and turned toward Mac. He could see a deep sadness in her eyes. I am not who you think I am, Mackenzie. I don't need to punish people for sin. Sin is its own punishment, devouring you from the inside. It's not my purpose to punish it. It's my joy to cure it. I don't understand. You're right, you don't, she said with a smile, still sad around its edges. But then again, we're not done yet. Just then, Jesus and Saria entered laughing through the back door, involved in their own conversation. Jesus came in dressed much like the day before, just jeans and a light blue button-down shirt that made his dark brown eyes stand out. Saria, on the other hand, was close in something so fine and lacy that it fairly flowed to the slightest breeze or spoken word. Rainbow patterns shimmered and reshaped with her every gesture. Mac wondered if she ever completely stopped moving. He rather doubted it. Papa leaned down to eye level with Mac. You raised some important questions, and we'll get around to them, I promise. But now, let's enjoy breakfast together. Okay, I'm going to stop and pause here. Either my reading speed is slower than I expected, or, it just takes longer to read. There seems to be a lot of little passages here of them just eating or just talking about mundane things. I guess that's how this fiction is working, right? It's not just a sermon being preached at you. So far, I find it kind of interesting. So it's on page 120 so far. So I plan to pick this up and at least read some more of it. I'm not sure that I plan to read the whole thing here, but at least enough of it so the message gets across for this author and that I get enough of this message. With all that said, thank you for your time. I'm getting a little hungry again. Maybe it's me reading all that stuff about the food. But for now, let me just end the stream.